Welcome to the HC Commodities Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're talking governmental policy, particularly US policy, and the complexity and challenges around actually implementing many of the recent legislations around the energy transition, such as the IRA. While many incentives have been put on the table, the complexity lies in actually navigating the various governmental institutions for approval, to get through procedures, and to get the permits required. And that's a story that has analogies around the Western world. The second part of the conversation is how much of the commodities sector, which has traditionally eschewed government relations, now needs to get engaged and to be part of the conversations going on around energy security and the energy transition. Our guest is Peter Stahley, Senior Vice President at Cassidy Associates, a governmental relations service. Prior to that, Peter spent 4 years on the Hill as a professional staff member on the US Committee of Energy and Natural Resources for Senator Joe Manchin, where he covered energy, mineral, and permitting policy, including relevant portions of the Inflation Reduction Act. Prior to that, Peter was a civil engineer in the National Park Service. As always, you can really support the show by leaving us a positive review on the platform you're listening on, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I guess the story we have today is really about the challenge and the complexity of implementing much of what is required for the energy transition, be that power grids, be that mining for critical metals, etc. And although we're going to focus on the US, as that's where you're an expert, much of this is analogous to around the world, especially the Western world, where there's a lot more complexity into permitting, different stakeholders, different governmental entities that need to be navigated. And we're going to end up on this sort of surprising outcome that for a sector that has long steered away from really too much government interaction and exposure, are now having to engage in governmental relations in a serious way to actually achieve their objectives in the commodities sector. So perhaps we can just set the scene. In the US, the last sort of 4 or 5 years, there's been a slew of policies tied to obviously energy security, but also now the energy transition. Can you just spend some time mapping that out for us? Because we hear a lot of the IRA, etc., but it'd be good to actually have those explained to us at least the top level and really what's been driving the administration as well as on the Hill.
So I think it's really instructive to start somewhere that is not directly a commodities or an energy issue, right? The COVID pandemic. So, it feels like forever ago, but, January of 2020, the world changed. And what I think that did when you turn to energy and commodities is it made everyone very, very aware of supply chain issues that we had all taken for granted, that containers would show up, that factories would keep running. And especially here in Washington, right, that brought a whole policy making and then implementation apparatus, sort of woke up. And then, so if you think ahead in the middle of that, the Trump administration, September of 2020, put out an executive order about supply chains focused on critical minerals. And that sort of grew out of a variety of think tanks, industry people. The U.S. Congress had been focusing. I think a guest who's been on your program before, Simon Moores, he had testified in front of Senate Energy and Natural Resources in the past few years. But I think that sort of kicked off official Washington on the sort of supply chain critical minerals front. And of course, Congress is always interested in energy policy writ large. In December of 2020, the at this point almost forgotten Energy Act of 2020 passed as part of the larger government funding measure. And then we had our administration transition to the Biden administration in January, where, immediately we went into discussion of infrastructure. And I think it's a little bit underappreciated that, in addition to bridges, tunnels, highways, sort of the normal stuff, our work at the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee and a variety of other committees, a lot of that was on supply chains, batteries, minerals. The Department of Energy gained several new programs. The United States Geological Service got new mandates and new authorities. And all in the backdrop of this, You can imagine with Senator Manchin, it was a very exciting time. There was a lot of pressure around Build Back Better, where we didn't go down that road for a variety of reasons, inflation concerns, cost concerns, energy security concerns. And then, as seems to happen all the time, the world changed again. And unfortunately, not necessarily for the better, with the invasion of Ukraine, February 2022. And that was a time when, in our policy world, it helped crystallize this idea that energy can be used as both a tool and a weapon. And in fact, we had a hearing shortly after the invasion on that exact topic. And I think it really opened a lot of eyes that all of this is interrelated, and further helped solidify this idea that mining critical minerals, strategic materials, is actually an unavoidable part of the energy transition story, and set the stage for, a series of both administration actions. The Defense Production Act invocation for mining and materials was in March. So it was, a month later, driven in no small part by this realization that while we're looking at, Russia's war with Ukraine, we have this backdrop of strategic competition with China. And, the drawing the lines between those two and thinking ahead is really not a big leap. I can say for Senator Manchin, we kept the focus on critical minerals, series of several hearings. Then we get to the Inflation Reduction Act. It would have been August of that year, which, you've had many guests on talking about wide-ranging impacts there. And then the one other thing I think I will mention, right? So it doesn't make the news. It's not a big focus. But National Defense Authorization Acts, in the U.S. Congress, we pass those every year, typically by December, if not earlier. And while there's been a focus on strategic materials everywhere from, munitions all the way upstream to the mine mouth, in 2022 and 2023, it became a focus where, for the first time since the Cold War, a variety of programs relating to stockpiling, security of supply were updated. So that sort of, fast forwards us 5 years or so till today, and now we're looking at implementing all of this.
Fascinating. Just sort of the long view, or the helicopter view, I should say, of this. What are the main, when you're talking to policymakers, and some, as you've highlighted, are steeped in this, and others it's relatively new. What are the main tools that they actually have available to them, around incentives and so forth? Because that kind of helps paint a picture of what we're going to come on to on that complexity of implementation. But when you look at the IRA, all of these various acts, what are the main tools they're using to further an agenda?
So it's a good question. What policy tools are available? What are policymakers thinking about? Tax incentives are one of them, obviously, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, grants, loans, a lot on the funding, the financial side, essentially trying to lower the risk of new projects, whether that's a solar farm, a new mine, a battery factory, by, influencing the finance side. And then, the part that was missing in all of this discussion, which was actually key to Senator Manchin's support for the Inflation Reduction Act, if everyone goes back in time, was that we were going to have a vote on a permitting package. Unfortunately, we didn't get all the way there, but there was a recognition that it can't just be the incentive side. We need the ability to actually build things. And we've sort of had this mismatch. And, the discussion about what programs, what agencies should get money, all of that was all well and good. But then even, traditionally among Democrats, where the idea of streamlining permitting has always been, viewed with a bit of skepticism, particularly around transmission, this growing realization that outside of these financial tools, we need to do something else.
Because that sort of sets us up for, we're going to look at the macro level of this complexity around implementation, permitting, the number of stakeholders at the federal level within government, also outside, but also at the state level. And then I guess we're going to go to the micro level and use some of your experience around critical minerals to just show how a project works its way through that and some of the challenges, and then, what it means to have government relations people involved in that. So at this macro level, can you just give us some sense of the complexity around the energy transition for policymakers?
I think, even if you're a member of, say, Congress or an appointed official or, the President of the United States, you have no choice but to some level have an understanding of fossil fuels, right? You can't avoid the political impact of gas prices, for example. And that said, right, everyone pays an electricity bill. There's sort of a direct connection and at least a base understanding. And then when you get to policymakers who are working in the energy space, we're not traders, we're not commodity experts, we're not, integrated oil and gas majors, but these markets are at least broadly understood, to a varying degree. I think there's this realization, and part of this is a educational effort from, industry think tanks, the projections of, say, the IEA or, benchmark minerals, that the mineral intensity of the energy transition is going to be much, much higher. I have a statistic I keep up on my board. I'm actually looking at it now, and this is very rough, right? About 15,000 million, so billion, tons per annum of coal, oil, gas. If you translate that roughly, and there's a lot of, assumptions and fudge factor here, but you're talking actually less in terms of tonnage, but it's 500 million tons per annum of various metals and everything. And again, lots and lots of assumptions, but that is orders and orders of magnitude higher than what we're doing now. And then on top of that, in DC, we got rid of, for example, the United States Bureau of Mines back in the 90s. It's sort of been a topic no one really thinks about.
Yeah, I mean, all the processing is also left as well, right? The technical know-how, not least the infrastructure to actually achieve some of these things.
Exactly. And that's, you can't talk about that without talking about the linkage to where the geographic concentration is today. And in the sort of educational effort here, both, as a former staffer, and then, everyone bringing information to us, it was sort of, oh, we don't know how to do this anymore. And the place where it is being done and that does know how, generally speaking, is China. And it's sort of something we just haven't thought about. And if you go back to COVID, right, and changing mindsets around this, that helped people who don't think about these things on a day-to-day basis realize, hey, if we look ahead and we're going to need lots and lots more, where are we getting it? How are we getting it? And that ties right into just, to meet climate challenges, we're going to have to build all sorts of things. And then on the related part, right, is national security, economic security. And, it's always dangerous to say anyone can figure out all of the complexity, because no one really can. But at a minimum, you would hope policymakers sort of understand the basics, just like they do on, oil and gas, and translating into the price of a gallon of gasoline. What is the equivalent of that going forward? And I think that's been, a real and ongoing struggle. Progress has been made. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been support for all of this legislation. But it's still a difficult problem to sit down with someone, and talk about where the lithium carbonate is coming and going, and, where we're going to get graphite, whether it's natural or synthetic, who's refining it, so on and so forth.
Partly because, as you've highlighted, not only is a huge amount of material, but also, we've done multiple episodes on tiny little critical metals, that are in just infinitesimal amounts in your iPhone, but are obviously a critical supply chain. And a lot of these supply chains are in Africa and other, in the developing world. And a lot of them, frankly, remain quite artisanal in mining as well. So you've also got that complexity coming in. On the one hand, you're looking to achieve the energy transition. On the other, there's probably a reluctance to articulate necessarily what it means and where some of these minerals are going to have to come from. And then obviously in turn, what it means if we start mining these within the domestic, within the 50 states or 51, what does that mean?
Exactly, right? Like I'm a civil engineer. I know enough to be dangerous on technical matters, but had I ever thought about, say, gallium and germanium in any serious way until very recently? No. And, frankly, nor should most people. But exactly, the critical mineral list right now, I don't have it in front of me, is up to somewhere, I think, in the 40s as far as number of elements. And even just if you focus on those, the Department of Energy has a different list. The Canadians have a different list. The Australians have a different list. Our Department of Defense has a different list. And the idea that any one person or any even small group of people can have a handle on all of that at once, very, very difficult, right? And I think, some of your guests have spoken about this quite eloquently. There's a very big difference between, say, even the copper market and having transparency into that versus cobalt, and then even further down the chain, say, again, germanium.
Yeah, okay. And then this kind of brings us to this fascinating chart, and hopefully we can include it in the show notes or a version of you then combine all of these different policies and bits of legislation. You haven't had the permitting legislation go through, and you end up with this spaghetti monster of a decision-making tree of all the different departments and groups that are engaged in any kind of decision around actually implementing some of these projects, or even going about getting the funding for them and so forth. I mean, that is, no matter how clear we are on sort of the policy side, if we are not going to be able to implement these, we're not going to get anywhere fast. And we're only just talking at the federal level here, right? There's a whole other layer of state and county and parish and so forth that you've got to get through as well.
I hope we can include the chart as well. And I think it's easy to fall into a character on the one side. So I want to be careful, right? We live in a very complex world. And so there's inherent complexity in that. And, it's a little bit tempting to look at this and say, that's crazy. The government's made a complete mess of this. And I'm sure, some of your listeners work in large corporations with quite a mess of its own org chart and who talks to who. But at the same time, while it makes sense that, say, the Department of the Interior here in the United States is focused on federal land management and the Department of Defense is focused on very different things, there's a necessary interaction in this, and more so than ever, right, in this new world where they have very specific mineral and material needs, or, you have the Department of Treasury and the IRS putting out the tax credit guidance, right, implementing the IRA, essentially helping to further refine these incentives that we talked about a little while ago, which in turn are then supposed to turn into, investment dollars in factories, in solar farms, in new mines. And you get to this question of how do you actually build it, whether it's here or in, say, with our Canadian partners or Australian partners, because sometimes to add to the complexity, right, the dollars flow across borders, for example, with like the Defense Production Act, where we're able to spend some of that with allies. Not to mention, when you look at the tax credit side again, with EVs and the various sourcing requirements. And then finally, right, you've got, as you said, we're just talking federally right now. And in the United States, then you have state jurisdictions. Many of these environmental laws that, we'll probably talk about in the permitting section are actually federal laws, but then have delegated authority down to the state level. So it's a bit of a mess, I think, is a safe way to describe it.
Yeah, and I guess that one piece which you've just alluded to is also, industry abhors uncertainty in this case, right? And there is still uncertainty around which tax credit to apply, or, various working mechanisms as to what level of grant you'd get in the IRA, which, again, means people are delaying project starts until they get that clarity. But you've also got this sort of, obviously, the tension set up where actually, yes, you do need to work your way through this complexity, but at the same time provide some level of certainty. And you can't really get there without a few test cases, right? I mean, it is a complex world.
Yeah, and it's, I think I remember one of your previous guests talked about how traders love volatility. And it made me laugh because project investors certainly don't. And especially as you look at, say, an auto company, right, looking to secure their battery supply and looking further and further upstream than they ever have in the past, that is not a world they are comfortable with. And at the same time, when you look at the politics of any of this, we all know decision making involves uncertainty. There are going to be trade offs, but the big swings, we'll call it, in both policy and market prices that affect whether or not these projects get to an investment decision are not exactly the easiest thing for our political system to deal with, here in the United States, I would say, or frankly elsewhere.
Yeah, and we're going to end up on that geopolitical consequence at the end, talking about, if the West is to compete in this and not lose energy security and all these goals, there are some challenges baked into the system. But let's, just for illustrations, I think this is sort of the core bit of the discussion that was fascinating and certainly eye-opening for me. In the context of, I don't know, make up whichever project you want, a critical metals mine somewhere in, Montana or something, can you just give us some sense of the complexity around actually getting that permitted and approved and underway before the shovel hits the ground?
I think the first thing to do, and I guess this maybe even gives you an idea of the complexity, right? Is so you mentioned Montana, could be any number of states, right? In the United States, the geology for most of what we're talking about is going to be the Western United States. So like anywhere else, you look at land ownership patterns. And in the West, it's mostly federal. Very much depends on the state. Probably the friendliest state administration for mining is Nevada. That's about 80% federal land. Montana, roughly 29%. So odds are you are either directly on federal land for all, if not most of your project, or have some bit that touches it. That if you look at, say, transmission for a second, right, long linear projects struggle with this because routing around federal land entirely is sort of off the table. And then, back to geology, if we're talking mines, you're almost certainly going to be touching federal land. So that opens up the whole question of which land management agency are you under. Odds are it's one of two. It's probably the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service. And then you go from there to all of the various subtypes of federal land. Is it an area of critical environmental concern? What sort of endangered species or threatened species under the Endangered Species Act are in the vicinity? Historic and cultural artifacts. What is the status of, tribal interests in the area? And beyond that, what is the history in that area? And I think we'll come to that a little bit later. But all of this then is probably before you even start what we would call an environmental impact statement under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And that multi-year process, right, even before you start that version of it, is when you end up doing, if you're doing this right, all of the research, all of the work with the agencies to figure out, are we even looking at a place that is moderately viable? And of course, right, the complication, of a mining project is the geology is the geology. Your drilling program is highly uncertain. It's, what I've learned is much more difficult than even, say, oil and gas, which has its own uncertainty. So you're working under multiple sets of uncertainty in what is often at minimum several year process, if not longer, just to even get to the beginning of that project review.
Yeah, and I guess conceptually, each of those different interested parties had the right to, if not outright say no, to considerably delay. And then you've also alluded to it, right? You've got, on the one hand, you've got a suite of policies around, we need more transmission, we need more critical minerals. On the other hand, you're getting legislation coming up, adding further protections to federal land. And, there's an inherent conflict there, which is kind of in the very crux of the energy transition that probably doesn't often make the public eye, does it? But that's just to highlight some of these challenges you're coming up against, I assume.
Right. And I think that's an excellent point there. You said all these various interest groups may have the ability to stop the project. And I think that's something I've learned talking to investors, people in the industries, energy or mining directly internationally. That's maybe a little bit of the surprise, the US context, or even for people who typically work on private land. In the United States, for the most part, many of the laws that we're working under and then the legal framework that we're working under is actually more procedural than a system whereby a group can get to a hard no. And so, the way I think that often manifests itself, and this is part of the, thorny issue of permitting reform, is we end up in this place where, a colleague of mine used to call it when I worked for the National Park Service, half jokingly, process is our most important product. And, in that context, we were actually trying to build infrastructure for the National Park Service, whether it was, wastewater treatment plants or visitor centers. But I think that's a good way to look at it. And part of that is because those are the underlying laws that, really grew out of the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s. And that's running up, as you said, against this realization that right now, for example, lithium ion battery supply chain or renewables or the transmission needed to connect them to the grid, right, are absolutely needed and as soon as possible to solve the climate issues, running into this trade-off of, okay, what does that mean in the context of all of these statutes and regulations and land management decisions that we've made? Because in a sense, you have we'll call it the environmental side of, statutes, regulations and all of that, with the added complexity of, again, out west, in many cases, the federal government is also the physical landlord, which introduces all of the politics that would come with that.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights in 2023. Enco has rapidly become the leading global expert network dedicated to energy and resources. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with Enco's experts for anything from a 1-hour insight call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
A lot of the market regulation around these, power in particular, is going to have to change as well as we start to introduce distributed generation. A lot of the markets, these independent ISOs, aren't set up to deal with that. And indeed, you've got, I'll say it, you don't have to, you've got a powerful lobby group in the established incumbent utilities that are also kind of going against that. But it's not just, it's right across the board, right? It's actually how to deal with the market side, how to deal with the infrastructure side. I mean, what was in that permitting proposed legislation that would have, I guess, greased the wheels, so to speak? And how close do we get to doing it, and is that still on the table in some form or fashion?
I try to be a realistic optimist, I guess is the way I would put it. So I'll start with the last part, which is yes, I think it's very much on the table. As widely reported in the Senate, Senator Manchin, Senator Barrasso are working on a permitting package. We're hopeful that progress continues to be made there. More broadly, right, you still have the administration, I think just yesterday, releasing some new rules and some funding on the transmission side, and across Congress, a variety of bills and interest in this area. So I think, yes, very much on the table. When you get to specifics, if you put it sort of in buckets, you have the FERC side, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which again, like as you spoke about, the energy market side, not my area of expertise, but that's one piece of the puzzle. Along with that, you have what I'll call agency procedure policy, right? That might be, how does the Bureau of Land Management make their decisions and under what timeframes? Because a lot of times, for a variety of reasons, some reasonable, a lot of these processes don't have timeframes on them. So when we passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act, we included a variety of permitting provisions, but they were somewhat narrow, not as impactful as the bigger permitting deal that was on the table at the time of the IRA. And then in addition to timelines, I think that the big third piece of this, and again, simplifying greatly, is on the legal procedure side. Right now there are sort of doom loops occasionally, if you will, where projects go back. And again, this ties into the proceduralism. An agency does something, it's challenged on the basis that they didn't follow procedure, not because the decision was wrong, but because, some piece of information wasn't considered, or some impact wasn't fully discussed, and it gets kicked back by a court and it goes back to the court. That court process often has no timeline. For example, a statute of limitations for many projects, meaning the time in which you can bring a lawsuit to challenge the permit, is sometimes up to 6 years, which, if you're trying to make an investment decision, back to uncertainty, investors really, really don't like the idea of having to wait 6 years before they're certain their permit is not, is going to be taken to court.
Which is part of the challenge, right? In the absence of legislation and quickly updated legislation and fast-moving legislation, that's when we get the judicial system deciding essentially what should be political outcomes, right? It's far easier, and this has been a trend for the last 20 or 15 years, it's far easier to tie it up in the courts than it is to tackle it through the body politic.
Oh, exactly. And I think I would recommend to listeners, Nick Bagley, can't remember the university, but he wrote this for the Niskanen Center, a piece called The Procedural Fetish, right? Which talks about this very system where the procedure has become more important than either, letting the elected side of government, make the policy decision, and resulting in this sort of, the best tactic is not so much to get a project canceled because the decision was no, but to get it canceled through an endless litigation loop. So you're right. That is a solution that is going to have to come from the Congress.
Yeah, and of course timescales have changed as well. Now going from a 0% interest environment to a 5-10% interest environment, you just don't have the same funds to hold on. Well, you painted a great picture there. I want to turn to governmental relations, lobbyists, and what they do and why they're actually crucial in this narrative. And so can you give us some sense of kind of the role and the tasks and outcomes that they're doing on behalf of clients, but then build that into a narrative about why the commodities sector, energy, metals, and ags have obviously had a very powerful presence for a long time, but these commodity traders, the metals piece, they are going to need to have more representation for their sector to help navigate and further this energy transition.
Sure. So I think there's this, we'll call it stereotype or perhaps caricature, where a lobbyist is, I don't know if you ever saw Thank You for Smoking.
Yeah.
Right, where that's the caricature, and there's, very, very fancy suits and slicked back hair. And I know you've seen me on video. I don't think that's me. And the way I like to think of it is problem solving. And in this context, right, all of these decisions have to do with public policy, and they involve trade-offs, and therefore it's unavoidable that, whether we're talking about a broad nationwide policy or the implementation of, a specific project, there's going to be a political dimension to that. And so that's one spot where, my background, I'm a civil engineer. Actually, our CEO is a PhD geologist here at our firm. And we talk about coming almost like any other consultant in other industries, right? Or when I was working as an engineer, helping people weigh their risks, weigh their opportunities, and figure out ways to execute projects. And so, zooming in a little, what does that mean? If you're trying to build, say, a project in the American West, not only, are you going through what I'll call the normal process of filing paperwork with agencies, but questions about the delegation in Congress, how does this align with their values, their goals, and also being able to communicate that to the members in a way that it makes sense to them. And then beyond that, oftentimes we can play a role in because of our oversight of just the broad policy space and, where we'll call it the Overton window of what is possible is, be able to bring solutions that folks might not otherwise think of. And one really good one, I think, that we do really well here is, for example, again, you have so much federal land ownership surrounding a lot of these projects. And when you can find solutions that the community is okay with, and in a lot of cases, this means the broader conservation community, and you can bring folks on board because you are improving wilderness characteristics in some adjacent land. Maybe there's a land transfer that needs to be worked out. And these are all the kind of things that I would argue a project developer or an investor in one of these projects, it's not what their expertise is, right? Like, I'm not going to look at their pro forma and say they're using the wrong discount rate. But conversely, this isn't the world they typically live in.
Yeah, and it's even sharper than that in, as you've argued, we discussed prior, in the commodities world, where that sort of the nature of the sector has kept it sort of away from the US government and governments around the world, indeed. And actually now there is a real need and demand for engagement with so much going on, whether it's sanctions, whether it's around stockpiling, suddenly the world of commodities, having spent many years sort of in small columns on the back part of a newspaper, is now front and center. And there's a real thirst for knowledge and a need for engagement.
For sure. And I think that was one of the things, when I was working on the Hill for Senator Mitch and at the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, being tasked with helping to shape his policy positions, and assist other congressional offices with where to go on this. One of the great stories about being a staffer in that position is pretty much everyone takes your phone call, but you have to know who to call. And, this, we'll call it secretive nature, for a variety of reasons within the commodity sector, made that very difficult, quite frankly. And then I think now, as you mentioned stockpiling, right? There's been a lot of discussion in the administration, around, does the strategic stockpile, say, of the Department of Defense or even the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, do we need to be rethinking how those work? Are there models for other commodities moving forward? And without, proactive engagement, it becomes really difficult for policymakers. I mean, one, frankly, just to know what is going to work, what is going to achieve their goals, but also for, I would argue, the commodity side to understand what's motivating a lot of these decisions. And, you're never going back to the caricature of a lobbyist. There's this idea that it's, you go to a fundraiser and then all of a sudden the politician wants to do whatever it is you said. Couldn't be farther from the truth. But even if you're, we'll use oil and gas here for a second. Oil and gas, especially on the commodity side, and, the vertical majors know this very, very well, have a very difficult time explaining how the oil and gas markets work and affect constituents. And to some extent, you're never going to get away from that. But at the same time, I would say that, especially if you follow some of the news coverage, say post-Ukraine, when the administration really needed to reach out and start to understand natural gas markets, those pre-existing relationships, even if sometimes they're icy depending on, what administration is in office or not, actually helped build, and I would say protect their business, but, build a solution that is delivering energy to Europe and the wider world right now.
There is an element to this that the trading aspect is notoriously difficult for everyone to get, right? Even, traders have trouble explaining it to their boards, shareholders, stakeholders, not least government, right? And certainly the people, how suddenly, a free market and these incredible profits made could actually lead to lower energy prices in Europe. But that's a different discussion.
Right. Sitting in front of a member saying, well, Senator, the price is set by the market, 14 times in a row.
Yeah.
While true, doesn't really help.
No. Just before we move on to this final piece of uncertainty, just from a sort of tactical level, and obviously I'm interested in it because of the nature of my work, but how have you seen, especially these large independent traders, and Jeremy Weir, the CEO of Trafigura, the FT conference said something interesting, which was he was asked how his role is different from 10 years ago when he first started in the position. And he was saying how much governmental engagement he and Trafigura now do. How have you seen those types of organizations change personnel, hire individuals to be able to begin this engagement, and kind of what in your mind is best practice? Do you need to have dedicated governmental relations people in-house, et cetera, et cetera?
So I'll give the somewhat frustrating "it depends" answer, but there needs to be some way to engage productively. And that's both, I'd say, on the actual engagement outreach conversation side, where having someone in-house who understands how Congress works, how an administration and, the federal bureaucracy works is really invaluable. But, much like, say, a construction company may have an engineer but doesn't retain an entire engineering firm in-house, the specialties of the various committees and the interplays between jurisdictions, very, very large firms who end up having, by the nature of their business, a very large amount of government interaction may do most of that in-house, but you'll see that even then they often retain consultants like our firm. And then as far as who and how to be successful, it's really, I think, about being honest and direct about, back to trade-offs, what your needs are, what is going to impact you or your firm from, any given policy measure, and being an honest broker of information. Going back again to a sector that isn't necessarily popular, as a staffer, it was invaluable for me to have both lobbyists and in-house government relations people who you can call, and full well where they're coming from and their interests, but within that realm that they are trustworthy and that they can get you the subject matter experts you need to answer questions. And again, as a staffer, sort of the flip side of that, right, is the BS detector is a very good tool to have. But once you can get those relationships built, when there's a time of crisis or some sort of disaster, those are the calls where people say, hey, we're trying to solve this problem. Who do you know that understands the natural gas market, right? That was a very real issue. How do we increase supply?
So indeed, actually, by having stronger relationships, it's sort of the wrong framing, I know, but it does also afford the opportunity to step in and capitalize in times of need as well, right? You're the first call.
Correct. And there is a reasonable fear, I think, when it comes to some of the traditional, I think, trading houses, that additional engagement may make you a target. And perhaps this is my eternal optimism. I do like to think that even if you're a target because of some worldwide event or a price spike, by having those workable relationships in place, you're able to at least get the facts across. One of Senator Manchin's, favorite sayings, which I take to heart, is you can have your own opinion, but you can't have your own facts.
Yeah. Okay, final couple of pieces. I do find this a fascinating discussion. And one is, of course, there is a natural uncertainty in the West, given our election cycles, compared to, obviously, in the context of this discussion, China, new presidents for life, and long-term viewpoints and policy making. How do you go about dealing with that uncertainty? And indeed, we're in a year where half the world's democracies are voting. Position yourself so that you're not caught off guard. Whoever wins, and particularly in the context of this, whoever running various committees and so forth that are so all powerful on the Hill.
So it's a tough question. We're intentionally not in the election predicting business. And so I think what that means is, optionality is important, preparing for contingencies. And, one thing on the commodity sector they probably understand maybe better than others is probabilities or thinking in bets, something I try to do. So, you're always looking at the possible outcomes. But that said, you can predict some of the changes, chairman at certain committees, leadership races, build relationships ahead of time. If someone works in energy policy and is expected to stay around, it is likely they'll do so, at least through a variety of transitions. Because that, post election, it's often very difficult. There's sort of a fire hose of information and people who want to come talk to you and tell you why their thing is the latest and greatest. So, if you're doing it too late, it just gets very, very hard to get through that just massive avalanche of information. But I think more than that, right? I don't know of any projects or sectors that you've covered or talked about that are really energy transition related that are a short-term investment such that, they can make their investment, make their money, and walk away all before an administration or a Congress changes, or, in other countries, whatever those election cycles are, right? If we're talking big mines, we're talking 40, 50-year projects. So I think what that really means is, to use in sort of the investor mindset, you still bet on your trends. And if you're going to go against a trend, you have to have a good case for that. You need to future-proof yourself. You have to sort of be agnostic, within reason to government change.
Yeah, I guess that's complicated at the moment because, especially with the energy transition, especially with the IRA, a lot of these projects are only viable in the wake of policy support, right? Not least, obviously, the grants to get the projects up and running and the scale of those, which can be very significant, but also actually the economics behind the product, right? A lot of biofuels, well, all biofuels, are economical because of policy support, not because of inherent economics, right? So that is the challenge when it comes to this sector in particular. Yes, you could probably make a big bet on if you're, certain of battery technologies and you want to make a bet on whatever critical metal it is. Some of the other things I think are really challenging and don't have that sort of inherent long range directional positivity, and are very dependent on administration to administration.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think that's sort of where, back to thinking in bets comes in, and sort of the probability space where, yeah, right. To be clear, some of the broader or more dramatic policy changes that could be affected even more than sort of these big sectoral or global trends. When we're talking about individual policies, yes, that's where what I would say the narrow specific expertise about what is likely, what is not becomes extremely important. And I will say that it is relatively easy, and I admit that, for a former staffer and now in government relations to take a little bit of the sectoral policy view as opposed to the individual projects. I'm sure it's not really any consolation to someone who started a lithium-ion battery company and some of the really early pioneers who, we could argue they were right, but they were 20 years too early and are no longer in business. So for sure, the timing matters.
Timing matters. Okay. Just before we move on to Cassidy Associates and when people should call you guys, how framed is this narrative in DC? I don't want to say existential, but the really high stakes competition that this represents with China and some of the challenges the West has inherently in this in terms of shorter election cycles and so forth, and many, many more stakeholders than a top-down planned economy where you just go build it.
It's a difficult one. Before switching to this role, it definitely kept me up at night, and it still does sometimes. I think both because of the politics and because of the information that policymakers are, absorbing, this competition and shifting, multipolar world. I think that is quite durable, and it makes the importance of getting this right, I think, even more crucial. And I mean that in the sense of, if we're talking about policy durability, right now, trade is a very complex topic, politically and just in terms of what someone should plan on for the future. The way I would put it is, if we're talking, say, about the battery supply chain, while Republicans may not be very excited to talk about it in terms of climate change, there is a very real, and I think fairly well understood, narrative about manufacturing and competition with China, right? Whereas on the Democratic side, when we talk about the batteries, it's often more with a climate framing. But regardless of the reasoning, I think there's the Venn diagram overlaps quite a bit. And I think that repeats sort of throughout this sector. And if you look at the House Select Committee on China, right, a very broad range of members and political outlooks from the further left to the further right. And yet that was one of the few things where I think pretty broad bipartisan consensus around this idea that policymaking for the foreseeable future, no matter what the realm, is going to be dealing with this idea of, a shifting global centers of power and competition with China. It's just the reality.
Yeah, as you say, actually, is that and it's understanding that Venn diagram and there within the space for which to operate, and there is that alignment ultimately between security and energy transition, which is what we started off with, right?
Right. That's where you find the opportunities, right, to get bipartisan support and move the ball forward.
Which we saw a bit of recently as well, which was heartening to see. Okay, well let's finish up on Cassidy Associates. Just give us some sense of who you are and when people should engage.
Sure. So Cassidy Associates has been here in Washington D.C. for about 50 years now. We're a bipartisan government relations firm. We have about 40 or so folks working in this space. One of the reasons I came here 4 months ago now from Senator Manchin's team was because it has an incredible energy and environment team, natural resources focus, which is everything from, utilities to the mining sector, the power sector, but then also conservation NGOs. And we have a variety of people who have worked, like myself, on the committee level, in leadership, Department of Defense, just sort of across the whole gamut. And the common thread there, I think, is we're a team of people that likes to solve problems. One of the other things that I found really unique here is that we also have an extremely strong transportation and infrastructure practice and Department and Defense practice. So, especially with my interest in sort of energy on public lands, and then even more so the mining, critical minerals, critical materials, the overlap with the Department of Defense and the national security nexus really means that, I can run down the hallway here and find an expert and somebody who knows both the right connections to make and what the sort of possibility space is. As far as when to call, I like to think we are the best at what we do, but if you're thinking in general terms about when to have conversations and you're in this, energy, environment, commodity space, ideally it's before you've made the decision to really start interacting with the key federal agencies. If we're talking about a mining project, you've probably done a little bit of exploration and you're trying to figure out, is this a real project? Do I have the drilling information? All that sort of thing. And setting up all of those interactions and how to frame things, what kind of, conservation interests are in the area is really, really key. So early engagement matters and really can sort of smooth the path forward.
Well, it's been fascinating. It's been great to make the connection. The HC Insider podcast now has its governmental policy expert as well in you, and I hope we can have you back on again in a post-election and see where we stand and what people should be looking out for.
Excellent. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.